we are going to move into the second part of our program for today, and I'm going to hand it over to Helen Armstrong, Associate Professor of Graphic Design with us here at NC State, to do the introductions.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tracy. Welcome back, everyone. I am very happy to introduce our speaker, Ellen Lupton. We're very lucky to have her here today. She is a Senior Curator of Contemporary Design at Cooper Hewitt, Smithsonian Design Museum in New York. You may have seen some of her wonderful exhibitions over the years, such as Face Values, Understanding AI, Herbert Bayer, Bauhaus Master, and The Senses, Design Beyond Vision. Her new projects include Health Design Thinking and Extra Bold, a feminist career guide for designers, which I'm personally extremely excited about. She's a founding director of the graphic design M.F.A program at MICA, Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore. And there she has been an amazing mentor to many, many designers over the years. Just special shout out, I would not have gotten through grad school with 2 infant twins without Ellen's support. She was a wonderful mentor to me as well. So just a little extra thanks there. She's authored numerous books on design, including Thinking with Type, Graphic Design Thinking, Graphic Design The New Basics, Type on Screen, and Design is Storytelling. She received the AIGA Gold Medal for Lifetime Achievement in 2007, and she was named a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2019. So special welcome to Ellen Lupton. I'm really excited to hear what she has to say today.
Thank you, Helen. It's so great to see you. Thank you all for having me. It's been an incredible morning, and I'm just delighted to be able to contribute in any way to what you are all doing. I want to say hello from Cooper Hewitt. We are the nation's design museum. We're located in New York City. We are currently closed to the public, but very much alive online, like many museums. So please visit us and check out all the stuff that we're doing. I'm also saying hello from MICA. We are also closed, but online and very much alive and very much in touch and engaged with our students and with the world. And I just want to say a note to all the students who are working, experiencing, struggling with the new situation in education. I know everybody has lost a lot. I am finding, that there are new kinds of presence that we can experience virtually, and those don't replace that time we spend together in the classroom, but they offer some new opportunities. And I think when we all come out of this, we'll find ourselves with new tools that we're going to keep. It's all going to be different. Some of the tools that we use are actually thousands of years old. And I just want to confirm that my slides are advancing, and you should see a picture of a book cover, yes, called Design is Storytelling. And human beings have been telling stories for as long as they've been designing stuff. And I think these two fundamental human experiences are actually deeply tied together. And I'm going to talk today about storytelling and design with an eye to sharing with you techniques for storytelling. How can you enhance the storytelling power of everything that you make, whether it's something in a medical context or in a more purely communication design context? And a lot of my examples are going to be where those two things meet, where health design, public health, medical design meet communication design, which is a special interest of mine. I think today in our current cultural moment of crisis, the syndemic of COVID-19 and racial injustice, storytelling is more important than ever for all of us. We are telling stories in order to inspire our communities, in order to get people to come along and to be active and to demand change. And we're also using design to preserve our own futures. You know, design is a tool for the self. It's a tool for mental survival. I love this image by Carlos Garcia O'Dowd of working at home. How fun that is. In the age of COVID-19. So I hope that stories can help us all. I met this amazing person, Bon Ku, 2 years ago. I had just finished writing or publishing the book, Design is Storytelling, and I had an exhibition open at Cooper Hewitt called Design for the Senses. And these two things were projects that culminated you know, several years of research and excitement about really tapping into the sensory and emotional side of design, and also to look at inclusive design as part of that sensory inclusion. And I was kind of stuck, like, what do I do now? I'm always very sad when I finish a big project. And these were two big projects that were kind of born together. And so thank God I met Dr. Bon Ku, because he had a project. He wanted to do a book about design and health. And he had read some of my books and said, I wish I could have a book like that. And I'm like, Bon, let's do it. So 2 years later, we had a book. And it was an incredible experience. And one of the themes of that book is actually storytelling as a tool for people designing healthcare. So I'm going to kind of go through some principles of storytelling and see how they can bring design for healthcare alive in many ways. So one of the things I learned about storytelling is that every story is a path. Every story is an event, you know, a series of events taking place over time. And that we as designers are sometimes designing a path for users. Sometimes we're designing more of a grid where designers make their own path. So we're creating the conditions for them to find their way through a space, through a book, through a website, through an app, through an experience. And as designers, we are path makers, right? We are controlling the movement of a viewer, or creating conditions of freedom within some element of control, right? And that's something every designer, when you start a project, you should ask yourself, which kind of path is this? Right. So I look at this picture of a forest, and immediately I see a path that invites me to enter. So I have the most fundamental conditions of a story, of narrative. I have point of view, I have a suggestion of motion and time, and I have a portal into entering a space, right? A space different from mine. And as designers, often that's what we are doing, is creating a portal that invites people to come along with us. This is a poster from Cooper Hewitt's collection. It's from the early 20th century. It's a travel poster. And the designer, M.F.A, has given us a path into the landscape that invites us to take a trip. And if we go with him, we are rewarded by sunlight and baby mushrooms, right? It's a good place to go. Now, a few decades later, M.F.A was making posters like this that were more modernist and futurist inspired. But this poster, even though it's more abstract, it still has a path. It still leads us from one place to another, and it leads us to the future. And the future was a motorcycle, okay? We're on a path now too. We're not quite sure where the path is going. It's a scary path, right? It's an arc, and we don't know quite how high the arc is going to go before it brings us back down. And so designers are creating many paths through this new environment. This is work by Georgia Lupi, who in the spring of 2020 responded with such optimism and happiness to what was really a devastating experience, something she witnessed both as a designer from Italy and as a designer living in New York. And so here she shows how cities are creating these new paths through their space that are for pedestrians and bicycles, and that this is kind of a beautiful thing, right? A beautiful kind of path making. Or she charted the migration of healthcare workers to the city of New York during the spring, people that wanted to be where they were needed most, and who took their own journey to help us in New York City. Or this mural by Yinka Ilori in London, which is out there in public space and that can only be experienced by walking past it, right? By literally taking a path towards what he pictures as a very optimistic future, right? Better days are coming. And many architects and environmental designers are trying to rethink the city, rethink the space of the city, and using these incredible graphics to picture a kind of new experience of urban space that has an element of control, right? So this is something that we're being called upon as graphic designers, especially, is to introduce a kind of regime of control into the city that's required for survival, right? Required to enable us to re-enter public life. This is a beautiful project by the Curator studio in Viccio, Italy, which is a small town near Florence. And they created this graphic patterning in the city square at the center of the town to help people make their own path through the city, right? There's a freedom to the path building, but it's also constrained, right, by the new rules of inhabiting public space. And around the city, they published this beautiful poster that explains their grid. And it's a beautiful grid that is gradated. The spaces become bigger at the center and they get smaller as you go. And so I love this interaction between urban graphics at this very large scale of the square, then interpreted by this beautiful graphic diagram that explained to people how it works. And this was really, and this is not a simulation or a visualization. These squares were really painted in this small town. And they're still there today, some 6 months later, because as Italy's curve went down and flattened, it alas then began to climb again. And the city decided to keep this installation because it was functioning so well for the people of the town. And so what I've been seeing watching design in the age of COVID is all these incredible experimental designs that are actually getting implemented because people need them, that they are more than brainstorming, right? They go beyond the ideation phase and are actually getting used. And that one of the or perhaps the only sort of positive side effect of COVID has been a kind of destruction of barriers against innovation, that innovative ideas are actually getting implemented and used that would have taken months of wrangling and community meetings and approvals and disapprovals. And these things are needed and they're being done. This is Paula Scher's incredible environmental signage for the High Line in New York City, and she's placed these green dots across this wonderful elevated park to help people make their path, right? To build their own dotted line and respect the space of other people. one of the most classic paths in narrative art is the arc. And this is a theory of literary movement, if you will, that's been around for 200 years. And it is a way that writers think about the structure of rising and falling energy in a story. And this arc also occurs throughout nature. It's the way my plants are growing in my front yard. They follow the arc of the sun. The tallest ones are where the sun, where the plants get the most sun. It's just this beautiful shape. And it's also a terrifying shape, right? It's the shape of the virus. And this graphic that was created in April of 2020 was a picture of how history might play out, right? That if human societies, and we learned that every society is different, would implement certain radical and not so radical measures, you could have an arc that followed that arc of the story, that peaked and settled. It's hard to predict a story when you're in the middle, right? And this is a little more detailed, right? So the role that graphic designers and information designers have had in this pandemic is huge, right? Being able to create something like this, which became essentially a public service announcement, right? It was not a picture of what was actually happening. It was a picture of what could happen if people changed their behavior and submitted to, these changes in public health. And that you could dive in deeply and see what would be the result, what would be the predicted result with various levels of intervention and change and effort, right? The effort made. This is what the curve actually looks like where I live in Maryland. So we had a curve that flattened and then rose back up, right? So it didn't work out like the picture. This is reality, and at the end of that curve is like, that's where we are now. This is a graphic by one of the doctors I follow on Twitter. And he points to, what we didn't know in March is forgivable, but what we do know, in July and August is just stupid, right? And how that curve, that narrative curve of the arc has been used as a graphic icon. This is the Emergency Design Collective. And I love how they show a group of people, doctors, designers, nurses, public health people, working together, right, to just pull at that curve and try to flatten it through combined effort. And then there's graphics like this, the cover of the New York Times, March 27th, 2020, and looking at the rise in unemployment at that moment. And of course, this chart would no longer fit on the front page of the New York Times, right? That history has continued to march forward in this inexorable way. So some of these images are very dark. This is Governor Andrew Cuomo's history painting of what happened in New York. He collaborated with an unidentified graphic artist to create this narrative representation of the rise and fall of COVID in the spring of 2020. And I'll take you on a little guided tour. And I owe these details to the art critic Jason Farrago from the New York Times. So we can kind of travel through this world that Andrew Cuomo has depicted for us of the virus arriving to JFK Airport from Europe, the president sitting on his moon saying, "Aw shucks, who cares? It's the flu." The discovery that masks are important, right? And that's happening right at the peak of the mountain. And all the hardworking people, the frontline workers, and also Andrew Cuomo's children and dogs, right? Everybody getting into the action. it's an incredible effort at graphic design that unfortunately leaves out the fact that New York City has more deaths than any other region in the world. So we have an image of triumph, but one that also hides a bit of the tragedy of what happened in that city. Another way to look at the idea of a narrative arc, perhaps a little more concise than what Andrew Cuomo did, right, is to look at a sequence of images, a 1, 2, 3, beginning, middle, end. And you'll see this pattern in lots of interaction design, web design, app design, lots of instructional material that aims to onboard a user, aims to attract a user to enter the portal of the story, right? And one way to do that is to say it's easy. This is a 1, 2, 3 sequence. You can do this. It's a pattern that you know. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And we see this pattern in some of the wonderful graphics being created in the face of COVID, that sequence, which is obviously simplification, right, of the true complexity of the situation. But that simplification into a pattern of 1, 2, 3 actually gives people great psychological comfort, and it makes complex ideas, difficult ideas, more accessible. So it's a really important pattern for us as designers to realize, right? So this is a graphic created by the Emergency Design Collective, and I urge you to go download it and keep it nearby. It's very important. And it's what to do if you're heading to the emergency room as a suspected COVID-19 patient. And imagine the terror of that, the uncertainty. And to make that uncertainty less intimidating, the designer has created 3 bands, right? 1, 2, 3, in order to make it less overwhelming. And then inside each of those 3 acts of this 3-act play is a lot more detail, right? But that division of the story into 3 parts is really important. And it's a really important tool for all of us who are trying to tell stories. We talked earlier with Matt Trowbridge, who's so amazing, about patient journeys, right? Or user journeys. This is a really important tool that graphic designers use as part of a team, or any kind of designer, not just graphic designers, is that analysis of a journey. And that the act of making these diagrams is actually the act of understanding what the journey is, right? We're not just communicating something, we're using that design process to understand something and then share it in a way that people get. So this is actually from Matt's slides this morning. And if you didn't hear his talk, it was incredible. And he talked about a workshop he did with his students at University of Virginia Medical School about donning and doffing PPE. So you'll see this path, right, this journey, breaks it into 3 really easy parts, right? And that helps us to understand it. But the actual journey is much more complex. And he and his students created this journey online, using online replacements for the army of Post-it notes that we used to use. I actually think this is better. I think it's better because everybody in the room can see what's going on, and you have a beautiful record of it when you're left. It's less ephemeral. So some of us may miss the physical quality of writing on Post-its and putting them up and moving them around. But there's something pretty great about taking these physical experiences and translating them to an online medium. And I think Matt really, he's running with it. He said, I'm leaning into digital and coming up with some pretty good methods. So the user journey is an analytical tool and a communication tool, right? because often that's what we're doing in design. We're doing both at once. It's also really important to think about the patient and the patient having their own journey and having agency and control and understanding of their journey. So this is incredible work by Katie McCurdy, who founded Pictal Health, which is a consultancy which helps patients to graph their journey. And these are patients with complex medical histories. And that's Katie. She started this by graphing her own history and had become exhausted explaining to different healthcare providers, you know, when her symptoms started and what was going on in her life at different parts. And so by visualizing this, she was able to be more clear herself about her own history, her own experience, but also to convey that to her providers. And so she started to do that with other patients and has created a consultancy about it, helping patients tell their own story, which is really incredible, beautiful, powerful work. And this is featured in our book with Bon Ku. This is another project by the Emergency Design Collective, a project led by the amazing Natasha Blum. This is the patient journey for someone dying of COVID-19. And this is so important to understand because, as Bon mentioned earlier, this journey must be redesigned. We must come up with tools to make this experience better for patients and their families. And the kind of first step is to understand what happens to people when they enter the hospital, and how can we reconnect people to a more human experience at the end of life, a process that for COVID patients is much more rapid than it is for most people experiencing the dying process. So it's some very intense stuff. So now that we're deep into emotions, let's talk about emotions and design, where I think that making an emotional connection with users is essential to what designers do. We've talked a lot today about empathy. Leslie Ann talked about empathy as something that we designers bring to the process of design thinking. This is from my book with Bon Ku, and we used as an example of empathy a design team that set out to design a device for OBGYN exams that are conducted in an emergency room. So if this has ever happened to you, you will recall that emergency rooms don't have proper gynecological tables. So the caregivers have to make do with what is around. And so a common solution is to shove a bedpan under the pelvis of the patient. And this is not a good experience for anybody involved. And it's not a good solution to a problem. There are millions of these exams are performed every year in the US. And yet there's not a proper device for making that dignified. Now, all the designers on the team, both men and women, had to experience what it's like to get this exam. So that was a way to bring empathy into the team. And the result is this incredible product, which is user-centered from a patient perspective, but also from a caregiver perspective, because it's easier to use, and even from the perspective of hospital administrators, because it's easy to store. And if you've ever been in an emergency room, you know there's just stuff piled everywhere, right? There's no neat cabinets with purpose-made storage. It's like a mess, right? So this is easy to store. I also love some examples of graphic designers and industrial designers adding empathy to all the new signage that we need in our public spaces. This is by Jamie Hayon, who's one of the great product designers working in Spain right now. And he brings such pleasure and joy to the idea of social distance. Even the coronavirus looks really cute in this picture, like a little happy space alien floating between these two penguins. Or this incredible signage from the National Palace Museum in Taiwan, which uses art from their collection to express social distance. And it brings a sense of joy and heritage and pride to these really important public health measures. Sometimes designers try to convey difficult content without emotion. So this is like what our Centers for Disease Control has provided to the people of the United States to download and print. It's kind of bloodless, right? It works, but it's bloodless and it has authority, right? This is Mona Chalabi's version, which I think is way cooler. And I think at NC State, you should print this out and put this all over campus, because I think students will respond to it a lot better than the Centers for Disease Control. Sometimes we want to be objective and emotional at the same time. This is the dashboard, the COVID dashboard, published by Johns Hopkins University and updated in real time. This is probably the single most important piece of graphic design created in the face of COVID-19. And it was created by an individual. It was not created by a group of administrators at Hopkins saying, hey, we should make a dashboard. There's a human being, a professor, Lauren Gardner, who had the idea to do this, that it was important in March of 2020 to do this. And she gathered around her other people and ultimately bigger support from her institution. But so many of these innovations actually come from individuals who want to do something. They are not mandated from on high. And this is an incredible dashboard. And oddly enough, some people on the right have criticized it because they think the use of the color red is too emotional. It's too negative. I think that's just wild, right? Like that's wild. So this is like real data, real content, live today. This is today's snapshot. And it is emotional. We should be emotional about it. I'm going to end with just very quickly show you one project by Eden Liu, an incredible designer who was introduced to me by Bon Ku. And she did this logo for The Last Mile, which is an organization that connects volunteers, helps them to deliver PPE to hospitals and other healthcare facilities. And The Last Mile called up Eden and said, can you make us a logo? And I want you to see that her logo is an image of a path, right? It's the path for delivering these supplies to frontline workers. And it's a beautiful logo. Is very successful at doing what it needs to do. But Eden Liu, she scratched her head and she said, maybe there's more that you need. Maybe a logo is just the start of this story. And so she looked at these graphics that were being created by the organization with what I can only call an engineer's perspective, right? These are process diagrams for all the things that have to take place in order to get the PPE to the volunteers, to the hospitals and clinics and care homes. And so Eden Liu said, what if we could simplify that and create a story that people understand, right? And it's an illustrated story that goes in a sequence. And maybe it leaves out some parts, right? It leaves out some detail and some decision branches, but it's a story that people can understand, and the story helps people get involved, right? It helps them to enter the portal, right? To walk down the path being offered by this service, this organization. And she worked with other designers to create these wonderful icons, and the icons are accessible, right? They tell a story. Some of them depict a path or a person moving, right? They depict people and characters and things and actions, right? These are the elements of storytelling. And she worked with this illustrator who goes like one step beyond the icons to really bring us into the emotional urgency of what this organization achieves and what the volunteers that get involved can make happen, right? So now we enter a scene and it's emotional and it's alive. And Eden Liu, she made this comment, sometimes graphic design is like being a janitor. And what's so beautiful about that is that janitors are essential workers. And often as graphic designers, we feel like we're not essential, right? We get to work at home and who needs us, right? But actually, graphic designers are needed, and we are essential ingredients in the process of bringing design thinking, which is more formative and more speculative. Graphic design helps bring design thinking into design, into creating the ultimate environment or product or service that people can use. I want to end with this incredible poster, this collaborative work that depicts the emotion of our time, the injustice of our time, the action required in our time, through the image of individual experience. So thank you, and thank you, Helen. I really appreciate being here with you.
Wow, thank you, Ellen. I feel like that talk had so much hope and joy in it in general that I think we all appreciate in this time. And it does really strike me that we do have a role to play, right? I feel newly inspired that we have a role to play in the story that's being written right now as designers and the parameters that are being set up. Okay, so we have time for a few questions. We have a couple here right now. If you have questions, please add them into the Q&A format. I can answer them from the chat too, but the Q&A is set up for this. So the first question that we have is suggestions on prototyping. So do you have suggestions on the prototyping process? Any suggested tools or things that you have seen recently for the online format that you feel like is would be interesting for them to explore right now?
That's a really great question. Because my field is more graphic design. Most of the tools that I use are two-dimensional. And there are great tools for that, right? There's Miro was mentioned, Mural was mentioned. I use an incredible little simple website called Padlet that's really fun for online sharing that doesn't require anybody to grab the screen, you know, which is, I think is a very awkward moment and intimidating for students. It was mentioned Google Slides. This is one of my favorite tools right now. Bon Ku and I use it all the time together to develop content. We're working on the second edition for our book, which came out in February of 2020. So guess what's missing? So we're working on a new version that will come out next spring. But we use Google Docs and Google Slides because it's very visual and easy, and it's great with students too. It's a great prototyping tool. Figma for people that are more super design literate is a great prototyping tool. But those are all more 2D. So I'm curious if anyone in the audience has ideas for how people can make, you know, physical things together. That's a little tougher, you know, a different challenge.
Okay, so I'm going to go into the next question. If anyone has more dimensional online tools that they want to share, go ahead and post it in the chat. It's nice to, this is a nice opportunity to do that. Okay, other questions. What are, let's see. Okay. With so many directions you can take with any visualization, what's the process you have to take to decide what areas to focus on? So what's your approach to creating visualizations? How do you decide the tone or the hierarchy, et cetera?
So you're talking, I think, about data visualizations. Well, that's a really interesting area because, you know, any data visualization is completely changed by things like what's the time scale, right? So if I show a detail, let's say of COVID in Maryland over the weekend, it looks very jaggy, right? So it looks like something that is, you know, radically different from day to day. However, if you look at that as a 14-day average, it takes on more of a trend, right? We see more of a curve. So that's just like fundamental to information design. And you actually, you know, you can manipulate people by choosing a time frame, a scale that suggests something being more chaotic or more extreme or a bigger, you know, drop or decline, simply by what detail of the information you've selected. And it's not technically lying because those numbers could be accurate, but it is misleading because it's denying the broader context, which would show you that something is trending up or trending down. Right, so that's a basic one. And then of course, what graphic designers bring to this is not just that technical stuff, but also things like choice of color, right? So the use of red in the JHU dashboard is very alarming. And other parts of their dashboard actually move away from that and use like gentler colors and, you know, I think perhaps responding to some of that critique, make it feel a little bit less of an assault. So it's a huge area, as you know, Helen, of what those kind of graphic design choices bring to help people interpret and react, right, to data.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, another question from the attendees. So, can you talk a little bit about working with non-designers? So, as collaborators, so you know, do you have any advice on ways to structure those kinds of interactions? The question is really around your favorite kind of inputs, or I think the question is about really bringing those groups together.
I am passionate about that subject. I have been promoting the idea of DIY design really for 20 years. It's nothing new to me. So to me, the idea of creating a design book for doctors and nurses is like right up my alley. To me, the sweet spot of health design thinking is when you have professional designers and medical people and patients and other stakeholders all together. The graphic designers and industrial designers and architects, they can't design this stuff without the medical expertise and the patient perspective. But the doctors need us too. So to get from a blue sky ideation into actually making a solution that is usable usually does require that collaboration from the design profession. And so a lot of the most important things that have come out of COVID-19, like the Spiro Wave ventilator, for example, which was designed in a matter of weeks to solve the ventilator, you know, crisis in New York City, was designed by professional industrial designers working with engineers and healthcare providers in a team. And I could give you many examples, but that's the sweet spot, that those forms of expertise really come together. So the term design thinking you know, it's sometimes critiqued because it was even mentioned today, for being reductive, right? That's because design thinking is not the whole story. Design thinking is the beginning of the story. And that there's a whole other element which can be woven into the process, right? Which does have to do with design decisions that have to do with form, functionality, ergonomics, typography, storytelling, the emotional value of color, you know, all those kind of things, the comfort of users. All of those things are like the expertise of the design profession. But we can't do it without everybody else involved on the team, you know.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, last question, because we're running out of time, but one more question. So first of all, just thank you for sharing all the COVID graphics. How do you see the role of graphic design continuing to play a role in helping people navigate the built environment? So as we looking forward, how do you see those two, graphic design and built environment, coming together?
It's essential. Speaking of essential workers, okay. So that in order for people to leave their homes and go back into places like museums and schools and airports and train stations, restaurants, they have to feel that measures have been made for public safety. So it's not enough for an organization to clean every night in the middle of the night, right? Or to have somebody at the door counting how many people walked in. That the message has to be conveyed through the design of the space, right? I have to enter the portal, right? Once again, I'm being asked to do something risky, right? Which is to enter into a space that is not my own. And graphic design and also interior design and architecture together have a role to play in asserting that this organization has taken these measures, right? Through signage, right? On the floor, at eye level, everywhere. Through things like a sink, right? At the entrance to encourage and insist upon hand washing, all kinds of things. Barriers, right, which may be partly symbolic, but they symbolize care, right? We can't see the ventilation system, right, which is actually more important than any of those other things, but we can see these other expressions of care, which must be designed.
Okay, wonderful. I think that's a nice place to leave it. It's great for us to reflect on. So thank you, Ellen, so much for joining us and sharing your thoughts with us.
It's been incredible to be here, and I can't wait for the panel that's coming up next. Thank you.